Die Frankfurter Buchmesse 2008, die Faszination Comic. Wir berichten live in Bild, Text, Ton und Video von dieser Leitmesse, die in diesem Jahr ihr 60. Jubiläum feiert.
Welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming and for being interested in the International Comics Market 2008. We are glad that we have experts and panelists from all over the world, from France, from the United States, from Japan, and from Italy. If you are wondering where our friend from Korea is, he has just becoming father, and he has promised to his wife that he will help with a little girl at home, so he can't come today. But we have 5 experts here from all over the world, and therefore it wouldn't be very difficult to become an impression of what is happening in the world in the field of the comics. Last year we've met here with a friend from Spain, and this year we will continue to discuss on everything, and we are very lucky to have again in Frankfurt Chuck Rosansky from Mile High Comics, and I would like to ask him to introduce himself, to tell what Chuck has done in the field of the comics, in the comic market.
Hello, it's really nice to be back. I was ill last year. I was in the hospital with a strange disease called West Nile fever, which I can tell some of you about after the talk if you want to hear, but it is a disease that attacks the brain and it can kill you, and I was very ill. This year, I'm doing much better, not 100% recovered, but enough to where I could come to the show. My provenance in comics is that I've been selling comics as a retailer since 1969. I've sold about $125 million in comics during that time. I'm the largest back issue comic seller in the world. I sell mostly American comics, though we are starting to sell a little bit more in the way of European. In addition to selling comics, I've been an advisor to a variety of American publishers at different times. I'm on DC's editorial board. I've been involved with half a dozen different Marvel regimes. I wrote the original history of Dark Horse Comics. I was there when Image was founded, when Valiant was founded, when Defiant was founded. I basically was one of the creators of the concept of having a comic book store. I opened one of the first comic book stores in America and pioneered that concept. I don't know. And I have a website, and I sell lots and lots and lots of comics. But I actually, at this point, am the 4th or 5th largest retailer of comics in America if you take publishers into account. In other words, milehighcomics.com, even though we don't publish any comic books at all, we outsell every publisher in America except for the top 4. So we have a fairly significant influence on the market, even though we are not actually publishers.
And you are editing a newsletter?
Yes.
2 times a week?
3 times a week. I have 100,000 readers who receive my email newsletter, and then I also write a monthly column for the Comics Buyer's Guide, which is the largest American fanzine for comics. And then on top of that, I write introductions to various comics books as well. So I write, among other things. Yeah.
Yes, and I've collected some questions out of your newsletters, and I've presented them here.
Okay.
For example, if you would like to comment to the following citations. While the rest of the world still seems intent upon going to pieces, our online comics business is doing just fine. What do you mean with this?
Well, we've been watching the international financial condition over the last month in particular just go terribly wrong. And yet, what we've seen is that during that period, our online comic sales have actually gone up. So instead of people taking comics purchasing out of their budgets, what we're seeing is that people are actually increasing the amount of comics that they're buying, even though they're afraid. They took a survey in America and they said that 80% of Americans at this point are worried about their financial futures. And yet our sales, even during the first 8 days of October, our sales were up 11% over the same 8 days October of last year. So we're seeing an actual growth in the sale of comics as a result of the current economic crisis rather than a decrease. Now, if things get really terrible, that could change. But right now, people are relieving some of their anxiety by reading comics.
Thank you. Perhaps the other questions we may put afterwards. Then I would like to ask Chigusa Ugino for a presentation of Turtle Murray Agency.
Hello. Hi. It's nice to be back. Hello, it's nice to be back again. Thank you for coming today. And this is already my third year taking part in this panel. And may I just briefly introduce our agency to you. Our agency is actually founded in 1948, and it's our 60th anniversary this year. It's the same as the Frankfurter Buchmesse, which is 60 years as well this year. And we're really happy to be able to be around that long. Actually, working in introducing Japanese manga abroad, it started in 1991, and it started from faxes coming in from Barcelona asking for Dragon Ball. And the publisher of Dragon Ball didn't have any facilities to respond, so we were asked to help. And that's how it all started. And by now we have, including myself, a dedicated staff of 7 full-time, working with 31 countries and dealing in 20 languages. And my last new thing was visiting Moscow for the first time last week. So it has been a very interesting visit to Moscow to see the interest there.
Will there be Dragon Ball in Russian, in the Russian language?
Not yet, but...
Very interesting. Oh, Latin can't come, therefore we might skip this and ask Claudio Curcio for a small presentation of what he's doing at the Napoli Comic Con.
Yeah, I'm the director of the International Comics Festival in Naples. We also work during the year doing exhibitions of Italian comics and promoting Italian comics, like here in Frankfurt, where we are with different publishers from Italy. We promote different artists like Milo Manara. We were in Poland 2 weeks ago for a festival. We'll be in France, etc. I'm coming from New York, where we had a collective exhibition of 10 artists in a gallery, and that's what we do essentially. We don't have the same market of my colleagues here, but internationally we have a good, we are well known internationally, and we are doing a lot to promoting Italian comics.
Yes, I've read in this article that you had made an official publication in English language. And
yes, just to present, to introduce the publisher that are here with us, and then to because in 100 years ago were published the first magazine for kids in Italy, the first issue of Corriere dei Piccoli. We had together with a lot of festival association and publisher, we had this special recognized from the Ministry of Culture that approved the National Committee for the promotion of the 100 years of Italian comics. It's just a small thing, but it means an official recognizing from institutions in Italy, and this is a very new thing for our country.
And the state is paying for it, for this publication. This Ministero per i beni e le attività culturali. They are paying for it.
The Ministry of Culture? Yes. Doing a committee, there are several national committees every year for celebration. I don't know, 500 years of Cristoforo Colombo and things like this. They go money just to promote abroad or in Italy this special events important for Italian culture.
And that's why you have taken this 100 years of the Italian comic to have the money, to get the money.
Yes, it's a special due to this anniversary. We thought it was time to ask some special improvement by the Ministry of Culture, and fortunately the Commission every year decides which is important and not for the Italian culture, decided that it was time for comics. So because the first issue was published in December 98, and so all the 2009 will be the year of celebration with several exhibitions, etc. It's a small amount of money. It's not, but it could help to do something interesting. And
but the Italian comic is older than 100 years, or not?
Yeah, it's older, but it's important to have this date because it was the really first publication intended like a comics publication.
Thank you. And now I would like to ask Didier for a presentation of what he is doing in France and Belgium.
So, I'm a comic expert. As a comic expert, I write about 400 articles about comics a year. And, on the website, mainly on the website actuabd.com, which is the main informed website about comics in France. Every day you have new, a little bit like you, every day you have new news about the comic scene in France. Also, I organize exhibitions. I was organizing last year, the beginning of this year, an exhibition in the Jewish Museum of Paris about the comics and the Jews. This exhibition was going in Amsterdam and will come in Frankfurt next February. And next year I will organize for the Belgian government a big exhibition about Belgian comics in 2009, because it's the year where the Museum of Hergé is opening in Belgium. So it's a very important year for the comics in Belgium. And the government, there is, in Belgium there is 4 governments, and and each government paid about 3 million euro to promote the comics in 2009. So so you will hear about the Belgian comics next year. So, well, yes, and I found amongst all the articles you have wrote, I found someone from Sébastien Langevin. Yes, may you translate? May you comment on what he had said? Yes, the Sébastien Langevin is one of the specialists of manga in France, and he said that thanks to the manga, the young people will come back in the bookstores. And that's true, because I think one of the problems of the French and Belgian comics, they were not involved in the young audience last years, and then of course because the quality, because the good offer, the large range of characters, the manga took the place, and thanks to that the manga succeed to have more than 40% of the market in France right now. And because the young audience is back in the bookstore, now the publishers, the French publishers are coming back to produce for a young audience. And that's very healthy. I think we have to, and I said last year, we have to thanks to the Japanese manga for the help to the comics industry in Europe.
Yes, and I found another thing. What does Cine has against Charlie Hebdo? What has happened there?
It's a long story. Difficult to resume, but Cine is an 80-year-old artist who founded in the 60s. Magazine very aggressive, very provocative, and he was in the team who created Charlie Hebdo, and before Harakiri and Charlie Hebdo, and Cine had for years and years a column in Charlie Hebdo, which is satirical Hebdo satirical weekly magazine, not that political, but a little bit. And in his article, he wrote something against the Jewish and against the Muslim, and because that, the director of the magazine barred Cine from Charlie Hebdo, and Cine created his own magazine the next month. But that was a big scandal in France.
Yes, he's already over 80 years old. No?
He is a little bit more than 80 years old. Yeah. And it's a little bit anecdotal, but that's the French market, very intellectual, and there is intellectual fights against the artists, and it's very philosophical.
Yes, if you have any questions, you may ask us. You may ask the participants, the panelists, if you want to ask something. Otherwise, we could start this.
There is a question.
I don't go. I have most questions.
Take the G'day.
Do you think comics are ahead of the curve in terms of serving a younger audience and keeping a younger audience up to date with current affairs and the reality of the world as compared to traditional book publishing? Because comics seem to be made by a younger creators, they fit better for a younger audience, whereas sometimes I think that the book publishing industry doesn't cater to a younger audience. I'm not talking about children's books, I'm talking about like the teenagers. Check.
Well, I certainly think that we're reaching a lot of a young audience right now. I just finished doing several comic shows in the US where I went and also Canada. I went to Montreal, I went to Baltimore, and at those shows I was seeing a large number of young people, some of whom were buying new comics that were being produced today, and quite a few of whom were buying back issue comics, because the price of back issues now in the US is significantly lower than the price of new comics. And that's something that I think is having an enormous impact on the overall United States market, and to a certain extent the market worldwide for comics. And I think that's something we should address at some point here.
Perhaps it's written in your newsletter. You have written that this year we will break the $1 billion barrier.
Yes, in terms of the overall market for comics in the United States. This is something that absolutely shocked me. And I've been at this business for a long time, and I didn't think that there was anything that could really just sort of set me back on my heels. But at the New York Comic Convention back last April, I was approached by two gentlemen who said they had purchased the sales data of eBay. And eBay, for those of you who might have missed it here, is an auction site, online auction site. And there's lots and lots of auctions on there, and people use eBay to sell to each other, bypassing the traditional market system of dealers. And what they told me was that last year in the comics category, now the comics category includes comics, original art, statues, and maybe some closely tied in comics toys, although there is also a toy category. But the comics category on eBay last year was $400 million. Now, to give you a basis of comparison, all the new comics publishers in America put together, Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, Image, comics and trade paperbacks, were $250 million. eBay by itself is 60% larger than the entire market for new comics in America. Then if you throw in conventions and online websites like my own, and the fact that people do still sell to each other in places besides eBay, I believe that we are at the point where the American comics market right now is the largest that it has ever been in history, and we didn't know it. But what has happened is that people are selling to each other, and there's this enormous circulation of comics occurring as a result.
eBay figures are international figures, not just American figures.
No, those were just for the American market.
Just for the American market.
Just for the American market, to the best of my knowledge, because the guys who told me that number were creating an online price guide, and the online price guide was specific to American titles. It wasn't going to do any other titles. But they didn't give me any real breakdown in terms of how much was comic books, how much was trades, how much was art. But just the very fact that the category itself was $400 million. I mean, that changed my whole view of the world. I mean, just like that. Because I was going along thinking, well, okay, Mile High Comics, we're doing $7 million a year. You know, we've got a fairly large percentage of what's going on. I figured out in that one moment that I didn't even have 1% of the American market. And that made my little heart go pity-pat. I got real greedy like that. I mean, just instantly. It's like, ooh, I can get a piece of that pie. And so, you know, moments like that are epiphanies. They change your whole life. You get all excited. And so I told my wife, we're going deeply in debt. I'm going to sell everything I own. I'm buying more comics, as many comics as I can get. And so that's what I've been doing.
At Baltimore, you have bought 250,000 comics.
Actually 300,000, but who's counting? It was at the Baltimore convention, I bought 18 tons of comics in 6 days. And I filled a 53-foot long truck, that's 17 meters, a 17-meter long truck. I filled it to the ceiling and shipped those back to Colorado. I have another truck like that. I actually have a warehouse now in New Jersey by New York. And it's over half full. And in 2 weeks I'm going to get another 18 tons of comics. I'm dead serious about this. I don't just blah, 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 blah. I mean, if I say that something is real, I put my money right there, okay? And I'm betting on comics.
Maybe I would like to look for my old collection for you.
And just to compliment, actually, we are seeing the decrease of sales of manga in America right now. It's really a serious problem for us because it's really collapsing. And actually in France too, it is shrinking. So maybe
It's not a collapse in France. It's just a little.
But actually in America, the sales of American comics have increased 12%. And the sales of Japanese comics in America only increased 4%. And it's actually, we are feeling now that the resurgence of American comics is really strong. So I just wanted to add something from my side that I really feel, started to feel that.
It's just like, Didier was saying, the Japan manga just helped the market, both in France and in America.
And now you may dictate the prices. If you have so many comics in the warehouses, then you can dictate the prices and...
No. I did a count. I helped start the comic book business, the comic book market in America in terms of comics not being sold through newsstands but being sold through comic shops. And I have the sales numbers approximately. And I did an estimate, and I estimate that there are 2 billion American comics that are owned by collectors. And if you extrapolate the 10% of the collectors in America either get divorced or move or die or for some reason have to sell their collections in a given year, that means that there are 200 million comics changing hands in America every year above and beyond the new comics market. As regards manga, we found that even trying to remainder digest-sized mangas at 50 cents, we can no longer sell them. Once the market in America disappears for a given product, it's gone. And unfortunately, manga was overproduced in America first. Second, a lot of the popular titles have now been put out there well enough that the readers of manga now have them, and there's not a new audience that's growing up. And then a lot of the newer projects that are being done today are not as popular. So it's a combination of factors. But in terms of backlist American comics, those are selling extremely well. We have a lot of mangas now that we buy wholesale from people who have large stocks of them, and we're buying them for 25 cents, and we try to sell a lot of them at $2 and $3, and unless they're ones that people already want to read, the first tier still sells really well, but you get into the second or the third tier and they're not selling.
Yes, that's very interesting to know. It really reflects what we know about the American market too. So we'll have to sort of think and do something about it.
It's enough. At Mile High Comics, I've searched for Inuyasha, for an example, and I found very many issues at Mile High Comics, but the prices are quite low, aren't they?
Yeah, we have our prices on, when you're dealing with the individual comics themselves, the hefta, they're very low. And oftentimes we put them on sale. Right now we're actually at a slightly higher point. I was 60% off on everything last week, so those prices would have been about 20% lower. So a lot of times we're selling at this point the books that were published by Viz or Tokyo Pop, we're selling those individual comics for 75 cents to $1.50, and that's a fairly regular occurrence. We used to sell those at $4 to $5 each, and we couldn't get them. Now they're in really steady supply, so our computer automatically changes our prices depending on how many copies we have on hand. So if you see a book there listed at a low price, that means I have a great many of them.
That's the point where we may change to the manga market in Japan. And I would like to ask Chibuza.
The list of data I have put out is for the year 2007, last year. It may be a little bit boring for the statistic, but it does give you the overview of how the market is doing. And actually, our market is shrinking. Well, compared to 2006, 2007, it's total minus of 2.3%, and the paperback sales dropped 1.5%, and the magazine sales dropped 3.2%. So the total market is actually shrinking for 12 years in succession. 12 12 years in succession. So once at the peak of the market size, we had 5.8 billion US dollars, but now it has come down to 4.6 billion dollars. This is the domestic Japanese manga market, which is actually, it takes up 25% of the book and magazine market on the whole. So 1 in 4 books in Japan is a manga. So that is quite a different picture than any country around, I suppose. But that's just the uniqueness of it. But so the market is shrinking. And the other interesting thing is the surge of the mobile phone market, which is, it used to be 30 million US dollars in March of 2006, and in 1 year it has tripled to the size of 106 million US dollars in March of 2007. So you have a very fast growing mobile phone market, and I have to add here that mobile content or mobile phone usage is much heavily balanced compared to the use of personal computers. I think in Europe and America, people use much more their computers, the screen. But in Japan, people actually use the phone for reading manga or paying to get on the train, or even taking the airplane, or you can take a photograph. Actually, the phone has many functions. So one of which you can read manga on the mobile phone, which is a different balance than you have with compared to Europe, America, where you actually use the PC more. So that has seen a really big growth. And on the whole, there have been mega hit titles which support the really high sales, but they rely much on animation, TV, and made into live action for TV. That hasn't changed at all. And what is another characteristic is that the number of new titles published in 2007 is 11,368, which is 403 titles more compared to the year before, 2006. So you're actually seeing more titles published into a smaller market. So this also illustrates the state of the market, although this is the sort of overall picture.
Yes, to compare to the French market.
Yeah, of course, if we compare the number of titles you publish in Japan, which is 11,000, to the French market, which is 4,000, so your offer is very strong, stronger than ours. And as you explained, indeed, the market. It's you said 10 times the French market. I think it's more about 8 times than 10. Well, the situation, thanks to the manga, the situation in France is that the market has increased the last 12 years, and thanks to the manga, but also thanks to all the other segments of the market. The comics, the US comics, is the blue, the purple one. It's more than 2 times, than 3 times than 7 years ago for only the US comics. The small press was also increasing, and the French comics are increasing slowly, and of course the manga was very strong last year. But as you can see, between 2006 and 2007, the progression of the manga is less important than before, and I think it's because all the blockbusters are on the market now, and there is no new blockbusters, so probably in next years the part of the manga will decrease a little bit, but I think it will stay strong because it's cheap, interesting. You have a large range of qualities, and and kind of comics. So more adapted for different audience. For example, the yaoi genre, the boys love genre, is becoming very high in France for the moment. So some in such segment of the market, the European publishers are not. So I think in the future the manga will stay an important part of the French market. So here you have the figures, and what is interesting on the French market is that more than 50% of the production is foreign production. Comes from Japan and US. So we have a strong domestic market together with a strong foreign market, which is, I think, a good indication of the quality of the French comics.
I think France is very international in that sense.
Yeah. And I think it's a good point, because thanks to that, the French artist can be on the level of the world quality, and I think it's very good for our domestic market to have such a concurrence. And yes, the turnover is quite stable. And when you say that you lose 2 points on your market, you can say your market is stable. It's the same in France. 1 year it's +2, the other year is -2. So it's quite. And you have to imagine, if the manga, if 40% of the market, the turnover is a little bit less, because the manga is very cheap, and so that point has an effect on the turnover. Yes, what is interesting also that we have 254 different publishers in France, which is incredible, and I think it's also a good factor, because thanks to that there is a creativity and offer very diversified, and well, they are not dying. If you go to a festival like Japan Expo, it's a new festival, and there are more than 140,000 visitors today. And in the same time, you have in Angoulême more than 200,000 visitors, and it's not the same market as well. There is some manga in Angoulême, but not that much, and so it's new market and new public. And so what is interesting this year, the manhwa, the Korean manga, have decreased a lot this year. I think it's because the offer of the manga is very strong, and so because it's a second choice, the public doesn't follow, and but there is some bestseller from Korea on the French market, and so I think the Korean publishers will maintain their presence on the French market, which is 10% of the manga market in France. So quickly, who are the leaders on the market? So the main producer in 2006 is Delcourt, and Delcourt, as you can see, is the number 4 in terms of turnover. So it's not because you publish a lot that you are the best seller in France. The first bestseller in France is the Media Participation Group, with labels like Dupuis, Dargaud. It's because it's mass market product for use, with a lot of production for use. They are very strong. Also, Media Participation owns by a family which is the owner of Michelin, the band, which is a big industry. So I think capitalistic intensity in the sector is very important, and this group is also very diversified in audiovisual business, and that's why he is the number one. After you have Glénat, because they are very strong thanks to the bestseller Titeuf, also a comic for youth, for a young audience. And Titeuf is, the last one was published 2 weeks ago. It's more than 1 million copies on the market for only one title. And at the same time they sell another million of the backlist. So, what else? The number one about production of US comics is Panini in France. Panini is a very strong company. Their turnover is the double of Media Participation because they have, I think, 9 different companies in Brazil, in Spain, in UK, in Germany. They are very diversified, which is different than Media Participation, which is only in France and in Belgium. And even they left the Dutch, they had a Dutch imprint, and they left the Dutch imprint this year. The main producer of manga is Tonkam, which is an imprint of Delcourt Group, but it's not the number one in turnover, because the number one in turnover is Media Participation with characters like Naruto and Death Note and etc. So I finished. Yeah, just to have a brief look on what are the bestsellers in France. You can see they are mainly domestic. It's characters like 13, Asterix, Kid Paddle. For example, 13, it was a sale of more than 1 million copies this year, but in the same time, they sell 2 million copies of Naruto. But it's not the same price because it's 12 euro for a 13, and it's less than 5 euro for a Naruto. So, in conclusion, I would just add a point. In France, you have a law who forbid to sell the books. You have a fixed price for the book, so you cannot sell the book less than the fixed price during a period of 9 months. And because to that, there is a best protection of the publishers in France, especially the little one, and that's why we have so much comic publisher in France, more than 250, as you could see.
Yeah, I think there's another situation there too, which is that in the United States we've seen a complete destruction of the corner newsstand and bookstore. Bookstores in America right now are disappearing very, very rapidly. People in America don't read anymore. Comics, the fact that comics have held up as well as they have is an indication of how creative that the American publishers have been in terms of keeping them alive. But the reason why you won't see million-selling comics in America is because there's no longer any venues in which to sell them. It used to be that America was a nation that had tons of thousands upon thousands of candy store newsstand type outlets, and the only city that has a lot of newsstands left anymore is New York, and for the most part at the New York newsstands they don't carry comics. If you go into France, or if you go into even you go to the Frankfurt airport, You'll see comics everywhere, but usually they're in special displays, and a lot of them are oriented towards younger people. We don't have that anymore. The biggest problem we have is that comics started being sold only in comic shops, and then the publishers refused to acknowledge that the comic shops were their primary delivery mechanism, and instead treated them with contempt. And the net result was that a lot of comic shops went out of business. So now there's only maybe 800 comic shops in America that sell any measure of volume at all. And the entire American comics industry is sitting on those 800 stores.
Yes, I've read it also in Italy that the numbers at the newsstands are going down. It's written here.
Yeah, yes. In fact, this is some kind of change is we are having in the comics market, because the tradition in Italy was in newsstand with titles, with Bonelli titles, the popular and traditional Italian comics, and also the Walt Disney comics. I think Italy was the first market for Walt Disney in some years ago, maybe 15 or 20 years ago. I remember the weekly Mickey Mouse magazine was selling more than 2 million copies every week. When I was a kid, actually, I remember it was everyone. Then obviously the market has changed, and so now the newsstand market is shrinking, but it's shrinking for a few companies. It's shrinking for Disney. They have a lot of problem with their publishing department, and I think since 3 or 4 years, I remember the publishing direction was in Italy, actually, for the Walt Disney company, and now the decision are in France, for example, and the Walt Disney company Italy is just reducing their people working in it, etc., etc. I think it's shrinking for all the publishers who had access to the newsstand market, and it was difficult to have access of the newsstand market in Italy because we have a larger amount of newsstands. So and the basis was of returnable copies. So to get in, you were forced to publish and send and spread a lot of comics, more than 30,000 for the entry level. So there are few publishers actually in the newsstand market, and their market is shrinking. But at the same time, all the other publisher and the comics market is knowing a new access to general bookshops. I mean, not comic shop, but the market of bookshop with a new interest thanks to the graphic novel wave, as we can say, a little bit all over the world. Last year I was talking here about the new interest in comics thanks to this little change of the name. Just talking about graphic novel was giving more importance in other area of the traditional culture in Italy. So more interest from the the audience, more interest from general publisher, and so we started to see big publisher like Mondadori, like Rizzoli, just start to have their own line of comic, a section of comics, a section of graphic novel, with something interesting, something not so good, but this just lets things change in the market, because big publisher could do the auction for rights were already won by big publisher, and now we are seeing a new moment with even some publisher like Rizzoli. They just bought a little publisher of comics. So this is an evolution of the situation. Not only a comic session made by the illustration editor or the young literature editor, but buying a structure and a little publishing with his own catalog, with editors, with people who knows the market. So it was for Rizzoli, who they bought Lizard with Corto Maltese inside it. And actually it's a little bit strange, because Rizzoli is the owner of Flammarion, who is the owner of Casterman.
Casterman is the publisher.
Got the right of Corto Maltese for France. Then they just buy the publisher in Italy of Corto Maltese. So sometimes it's strange what they do, but
I don't think it's strange.
Anyway, other publisher, other general publisher, they are buying little comics publisher, and the fact that this publisher were selling in the normal bookshop system just helped all the comics publisher to enter in the normal comic book market and system. I just talked with a publisher, one of the publishers with us here, and he said thanks to this, because maybe in newsstand the sales are going down, but they have a new, it's just like a new market, because we have some kind of 250 or 300 comic shop in Italy, but we have 12 to 15 times of bookshop. So this means, and the system, the distribution is different. It works well, rather well. So it could be interesting to see what will be next year. Maybe.
It was the same in France those last years. This year, for example, Gallimard, which is the first publisher of literature in France, published in comics The Little Prince of Saint-Exupéry by Johann Sfar, which is one of the main artists from the new wave of the graphic novels, and it's a big success worldwide, in all the countries.
In Italy, for example,
it's a deep trend.
We are waiting for this kind of thing. I mean, production from a big publisher, production of original Italian content comics, because now they are just buying rights or just buying publisher who has in catalog some Italian comics. But if some of these big publishers could afford paying big authors, big Italian authors or Italian artists with writers from other countries, it would be interesting.
The bestsellers of the foreign rights by Delcourt, for example, is adaptation from literature. So I think there is a big line between literature and comics, and I think it's a good deal for the comics.
Yes, we are already discussing for 1 hour. Therefore, afterwards we will have something to drink. The lady is already waiting over there. But perhaps we should have a final statements. And Didier wants to add something on Turkish comics.
Yes, because Turkish was the country invited. It's a pity that Mr. Levin was not coming, but I would like to give an homage to the Turkish comics, because first it's a big country, more than 100 million people, and the comics tradition was very present from years and years in this country. And before it was, the country for the counterfact, the copy. They copy. For example, in the 50s there was Tintin, the Tintin character. They were more adventures published in Turkey than in the regular publishing. There is a Tintin secret in the Marmara Sea, for example. But now, for those recent years, the situation changed completely, because I think there is a middle class very strong, very richer than before, and they publish a lot of French artists like Bilal, for example, also the Spanish Guardino, and also the local production of the Turkish comics it's very good. There is a strong quality, very influenced by the underground comics and magazine like Mad Magazine. And if you see all the magazine in the bookstore in Istanbul, for example, there is a lot of local RV Kurtzman in Turkey. And yes, it's a good quality. I invite you to check on the booth of Turkey. There is a lot of interesting things. That was my.
Thank you. I would ask whether Chuck has something to add to this discussion panel.
Well, one thing that didn't get brought up, and I did want to mention this, in America, since the numbers of comics being sold by the new publishers have declined quite a bit, one major executive at a company that shall not be named has managed to convince his bosses to no longer consider comics as a publishing unit. Comics are now considered R&D for film, which means it's research and development money, and where the real profit comes from is when they turn out a Dark Knight or an Iron Man, and they reap hundreds of millions of dollars, not only in fees from the film, but also licensing fees that are associated. And so in the United States, a major shift has occurred to where they're willing to lose money on sending comics out because they're trying to maintain their copyrights, and because they're using those for research and development, for moving into other media platforms. But I do think the one thing that I've been hearing here is that the beginning of the internet revolution, which I see rapidly changing the face of American, not only comics publishing, but book publishing in general, is starting to have an effect even in Europe and Japan, where the institutions are much more culturally protected than they are in the United States. But as we've recently discovered with the stock market, what begins in America oftentimes spreads to the rest of the world.
It's true what you say, because I learned today that Luc Besson, the filmmaker, created a joint venture with Glénat this week. So what is described is exactly true.
Do you have to add something, Chikusa? You have written down something, traditional boundaries, and so on.
So, as you mentioned, the film R&D aspect, as the sales of manga in America, France, worldwide is declining, one of the aspects we're trying to do is bringing Japanese content, of course, to Hollywood. And actually we have been able to close our first deal at Tatomori Agency with Fox 2 months ago, and it was case one, actually. Yes, and so it is also a direction that we're trying to investigate and spend more time, as well as making much more full use of the internet, yes, as a new facade. So for us, it's Hollywood, it's the internet, and Russia. Exactly.
Do you have something to add to the panel discussion?
I think the Italian market is not such important like Japan, United States, or France. So I think what they say it's important for a global view of what it could be and what could be the future for the comics market. Yeah, Eastern country, maybe with a lot of people. Just adding, we were in Poland with Manara, and they just have a new market growing, and it's like in Italy maybe 20 or 25 years ago, except that they have this hole because of the communist period without a publishing industry, and so they don't have big publisher like we have in Italy with Bonelli or Astorina, that they start just after the war, and so now they are 60-year companies. And in Poland, it's new, and I think it's new in all the Eastern countries. So they are running to.
Do you know that in Poland the manga owns 75% of the market? And you know why? Because the main publisher of manga are married to Japanese.
Yes. Thanks a lot for coming, dear panelists. If you have any further questions, we will be over there to have a refreshing drink.
And I am giving a talk on the U.S. market tomorrow at 1 p.m. So if anybody would like to hear just about the U.S. market, and it'll be a lot of questions and answers. So if you have any questions about the U.S. market, bring them to my talk tomorrow.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.